The winter the pear orchards failed across the whole of the valley. One woman's hogs stood at the fence line and blinked in the cold with the particular contentment of animals who had been fed well and fed long. They did not know they were a miracle. They only knew they were not hungry. But everyone else knew, and that was the thing people could not stop talking about when the talking finally started, which was only after the silence. And the silence only came after the disbelief, and the disbelief only came after the scale tickets arrived, and the weights were posted at the co-op on the third Tuesday of January, and the numbers did not match what anyone expected from a season like that one. Maren Solstad's hogs averaged 241 pounds at market. The next nearest pen came in at 182. The distance between those two numbers was the distance between a woman who had been mocked quietly for most of a calendar year and a county that had run out of quiet ways to explain what it was seeing. There is an old saying among people who raise animals through lean years, a saying that does not appear in any extension office bulletin or county almanac, but that moves through generations like a habit of posture. It goes, "The animal tells you what the season has been, and the season never lies." Maren had heard it from her grandfather, who had heard it from his mother, who had apparently repeated it so often that her children could recite it before they could read. Maren was 53 years old that autumn. She had been raising hogs on the same 40 acres since she was 31, when her grandfather died, and left her the operation in a will that her two uncles contested for 11 months before a probate court in the county seat upheld the bequest on the grounds that the deed named her specifically and without ambiguity. She had weathered those 11 months. She had weathered others. The question everyone would later ask, and ask imprecisely, was why she had driven out to the Hollowell packing shed on a Tuesday morning in late August and paid a man named Gerald Hollowell $10 for 70 crates of bruised pears that he had been planning to haul to the compost windrow behind the old cannery. Nobody asked that question well. They asked it as though the answer was either luck or eccentricity. It was neither. Gerald Hollowell remembered the transaction with the precision of a man who had been embarrassed by a thing for so long that he had memorized every detail of it in self-defense. He had been standing at the back of the packing shed sorting out the grayed-out fruit, the soft ones, the split ones, the ones with the brown sugar smell that meant they had begun to turn inside, when the old green truck came down the lane and parked without ceremony. Maren came around the back of the truck without greeting him first, which he later said was characteristic of her, and she looked at the crates for a long time before she spoke. She said, "I will take all of it." He said he was going to compost it, that it was unsellable, that she would be hauling off a problem and not a product. She said, "I know what I am hauling." He told her he would take $10 for labor on the crates. She paid him without negotiating. He watched her and the boy she had brought, her neighbor's son who was 14 that summer, load all 70 crates into the truck bed in a single afternoon. And when they drove out, he stood in the shed door and felt something he could not name at the time, but which he would later describe as a kind of unease. The feeling you get when someone knows the price of a thing that you have just thrown away. He did not act on the feeling. He went home and had his supper, and did not think about it again until January, at which point he thought about almost nothing else for several weeks. The reason Maren had wanted the pears was written in a notebook her grandfather had kept in a coffee tin on the third shelf of the barn office, a tin that also contained 3 wooden-handled awls, a folded survey map, and a 1958 calendar from a feed company that no longer existed. The notebook was not labeled. It was a standard composition book with a black and white cover, and the pages were written in a hand so small and so even that it looked at first like a printed document. Marin had read it so many times that certain pages fell open under their own authority. The relevant passage was in the third section, under a heading that said simply, August Feeding Notes, and it described in precise and almost clinical language what happened to a hog's rate of gain when its ration was supplemented with high-sugar bruised fruit during the critical conditioning window between late August and early November. The passage said, "The animal does not care that the pear is imperfect. The animal only cares that the sugar is available. High sugar from fruit in the final conditioning weeks before the cold sets pushes subcutaneous fat development in a way that winter corn rations alone cannot replicate." I have seen this now in 4 consecutive years, and the results do not vary. The animal tells you what the season has been, and the season never lies. The passage was dated September of 1961. Marin's grandfather had been 34 years old that year. The science, as she understood it, was imprecise and personal, and had never been published anywhere. But she had tested it herself in 3 separate years before that autumn, and the results had not varied for her either. The fruit itself was free to her in all but name. $10 for 70 crates of grayed-out pears from a co-op packing shed was not a purchase so much as a removal service, and she had known that Gerald would be relieved to have the crates taken. What she had not known, and what she could not have known, was that the pear crop across the wider valley would be the worst in 31 years, which is to say, the worst since 1992, which is to say, the worst since a frost event so catastrophically timed that the county extension office had written a commemorative bulletin about it. What arrived in late August of that year, 2 weeks after she loaded the crates, was a version of that same misfortune. A second bloom period induced by a false warm spell in July, followed by a late blight pressure that moved through the valley's orchards over 11 days and turned what should have been a deep and abundant harvest into a scattered, soft, unsellable mess. The Hollowell packing shed, which processed for 12 grower families in addition to Gerald's own 40 acres, would end the season with 30% of its normal throughput. The co-op bulletin that circulated in September said simply, "Difficult conditions are expected to persist through the winter feeding period." This was an understatement. What it meant in practice was that the standard supplemental feeds that hog operations in the valley relied on to finish their animals through the cold months would be tight, priced above what most budget models had assumed, and in some cases simply unavailable at the volumes needed. Marin had not predicted the blight precisely. She had predicted a season of irregularity because the July warm spell had told her so, because the notebook told her what July warm spells tend to precede, because she had been watching the same sky and the same soil for 22 years and had developed a reading practice that did not require confirmation from any external authority. The hogs ate the pears through September and into October, every bruised and split and sugar-heavy crate of them, and they ate them with the particular dedication of animals who are being given exactly what their bodies have been asking for. The boy who helped load them, whose name was Dmitri, and whose mother rented the 30 acres that adjoined Marin's north fence line, came back to help with the feeding process and said almost nothing during the first 3 visits. On the 4th visit, he asked her why she was giving them fruit. She said, "Because the winter is going to be long, and I want them ready." He said, "How do you know the winter will be long?" She said, "I do not know it." The notebook says it is likely, and the hogs agree. He did not entirely understand this, but he came back the following week and the week after that, and by October he was arriving without being asked, which Marin registered but did not remark upon. The first person who arrived to deliver an opinion was Raymond Cates, who ran the largest independent hog operation in the county, which at that time was somewhere near 600 head. He came by in the second week of September on his way back from the co-op, which he did once or twice a season, dropping in on smaller operations the way a man of means drops in on acquaintances. Warmly, briefly, and with the unconscious air of someone surveying the situation. He stood at the fence and looked at the feeding arrangement, at the cut pears in the supplemental troughs, at the hogs eating them, and he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. He said that it was a real shame about the fruit season, and that he hoped she was not paying market price for that grayed-out material, and that the research he had seen from the state extension indicated that complex sugars in late conditioning rations could cause inconsistency in fat distribution. Marin was mending a section of fence panel 30 feet away. She said, "I am not paying market price." Raymond waited for more. She did not provide any. He said the co-op had a supplemental program for producers who needed support with feed costs, and that she ought to look into it. She said she would look into it. She returned to the fence panel. Raymond drove out after another few minutes. The extension agent came in October. His name was Todd Bierman, and he was 31 years old and had been in the county for 2 seasons, which was long enough to have opinions and not quite long enough to know which opinions to keep private. He came with a clipboard and a printout from a regional livestock productivity study. He stood at the edge of the lot and watched the operation with the expression of a man who is composing his concerns into diplomatic language. He said the study indicated that fruit supplementation showed inconsistent results across pen trials, and that his office was recommending against it as a primary strategy, particularly in years with irregular fruit quality. He said the bruised pears specifically introduced a microbial variable that could compromise gut integrity if the animals were not carefully monitored. Marin was filling the water tank at the far end of the lot. She said, "They are carefully monitored." He wrote something on his clipboard and said that if she needed access to the co-op's emergency feed stabilization program, she should not wait because the allocations were filling up and he wanted to make sure smaller producers had what they needed. Marin said, "I have what I need." She went back to the water. He wrote something else on his clipboard and left. Raymond Cates's wife, Loretta, came in late October with a foil-covered casserole and a kind of sympathy that had no particular object. She stood in the yard and talked for 20 minutes about the difficulty of the season and the losses that everyone was facing, and the way the co-op had really stepped up, in her view, to support the producer community. She said it quietly and warmly and with the sincere goodwill of a woman who did not realize that what she was offering was consolation for a disaster that had not yet occurred to the person she was offering it to. Marin thanked her for the casserole. She set it on the porch railing. She said, "It is a hard season for a lot of people." Loretta looked at the lot, at the hogs, at the feeding arrangement, and said she hoped things were not too difficult. Marin said they were not. Loretta drove away with the feeling, which she described later, of having spoken to a woman who was not entirely present in the conversation, as though part of her attention was somewhere else entirely and had been there for some time. This was accurate. Marin's attention was on the animals, who were telling her, in the slow and wordless language of weight and posture and the quality of their winter coats, that they were ready. Dmitri had started arriving before school on the days his mother's truck was free, which was 3 mornings a week. He had by this point developed a functional understanding of the feeding schedule and a reliable hand with the gate latches, which were old and required a specific angle of pressure that most adults learned slowly. He was learning it all at the pace of a person who watches more than he asks, and Marin found this adequate. One morning in late October, he brought the notebook from the barn office to the fence where she was standing and asked her who had written it. She said, "My grandfather." He asked if the grandfather had been right about other things too. She said, "He was right about most things he wrote down." Dmitri turned the pages carefully, which she noticed and approved of, and then he closed it and handed it back and said nothing more. But the following week, he asked her where she kept the feeding records, and when she showed him, he began keeping a parallel set of notes in a wire-bound school notebook that he bought himself, recording daily weights and ration volumes and his own observations about behavior and coat condition, in a handwriting that was large and uneven, but entirely legible. He did not ask her to look at it. She looked at it when he was not there. It was accurate. She did not tell him she had looked at it. November arrived with the cold that the notebook had suggested it would. Not catastrophic cold, not yet, but the structural cold of a season that has decided what it intends to do and is arranging itself accordingly. The feed prices at the co-op had by this point risen to a level that Todd Bierman's printouts had not anticipated. The emergency stabilization program that he had mentioned to Marin in October had been oversubscribed by the middle of October and was closed to new applicants by the 1st of November. Raymond Cates, who had 600 head to carry through, had contracts with 2 regional distributors that gave him some price protection. But the volume shortfalls were real, and his per-head finishing costs were climbing in ways that his spreadsheets had not modeled. He did not come by Marin's operation in November. He was occupied. The valley settled into the business of managing a difficult winter with the resources that were available, which in most cases were fewer than people had planned for and more expensive than they could comfortably absorb. Marin's hogs came off the pear supplementation in early November and moved to their standard winter ration, which was corn and soy, and the commercial mineral mix she had ordered in July before the prices moved. She had ordered enough for the full winter period because the notebook said to order feed before the season showed its character, and because she had been doing this long enough to know that July prices and February prices are different prices. The animals carried the conditioning from the fruit period into the cold like a stored resource, which is precisely what it was. Their subcutaneous fat was laid on evenly and deeply. Their gut flora, contrary to Todd Bierman's concern about microbial variables, were in exceptional condition because the fruit sugars, being natural and varied, had fed the beneficial populations in ways that a monoculture corn ration alone does not. She had read this in the notebook too, though her grandfather had described it differently in the language of a man who had no access to the science, but had arrived at the observation through 3 decades of watching what happened to animals who were fed certain ways. He had written, "They winter better when the autumn has been rich. You cannot put the richness in at the back end. It has to be there from the start of the cold." Marin had read this sentence so many times it had ceased to be language and had become something more like reflex. The real cold came in December. It came the way the notebook said it would in years that followed the pattern of a false July warm spell followed by early blight, which is to say it came hard, and it came early, and it came without the gradual preparation of a normal seasonal transition. The thermometer at Marin's barn office registered 11 degrees on the 14th of December, which was the coldest 14th of December anyone in the valley could verify against written records, though several older residents claimed to remember worse. The week that followed was not worse in temperature, but it was worse in duration, and the combination of sustained cold and the feed supply problems that were already under stress produced a series of outcomes that Todd Bierman's clipboard had not prepared anyone for. Two operations in the south end of the county began losing animals to stress and poor conditioning in the third week of December. Raymond Cates lost 14 head between the 22nd of December and the 2nd of January, which was the period he later described in the quarterly meeting of the Producer Association as the worst 2 weeks of his professional life. He did not offer a detailed accounting of the losses at that meeting because the meeting was not the right venue, but the number had circulated privately through the co-op network before the meeting even convened, as numbers of that kind always do. Marin's hogs lost none. They moved through the cold with the equanimity of animals who have been prepared for it, which is to say, they moved through it as though it were simply what winter was, and they were simply what animals are. They stood at the fence in the early mornings and blinked into the cold and ate their rations and put weight on through conditions that were stripping weight from animals in every adjacent operation. Dimitri came on the 3 mornings a week when the truck was free and sometimes on the 4th morning when it was not, having walked the 1.5 miles from his mother's house in the dark. He did not announce this. Marin learned it from his boot tracks in the snow at the gate. She did not remark on it to him, but she began leaving the barn office unlocked and the small cast-iron stove lit on the mornings she expected him, and she stocked the shelf beside the stove with a thermos and 2 cups, which she had not kept there before. The scale tickets were posted at the co-op on the 3rd Tuesday of January, and the weights were what they were. 241 pounds average across Marin's pen. The numbers beside them, the numbers for every other operation that had weighed in that week, were the numbers of animals that had wintered poorly through a brutal season in which the preparation had not been what the season required. The distance between Marin's numbers and the next nearest was not something that could be attributed to breed or luck or any of the other explanations that began circulating within the hour. The pens were the same breeds. The feed had been the same feed in the period when the same feed was available. The difference was in what had happened in August and September and October, in the 70 crates of Bruised Pears that everyone now remembered hearing about and had filed at the time under either eccentricity or grief-adjacent behavior, as though a woman who bought grayed-out fruit for her animals must be doing it for emotional rather than practical reasons. Raymond Cates came to the farm on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of January. He came in the afternoon, when the light was already going thin and orange at the tree line, and he came alone, without the warmth of his seasonal drop-in manner, and without the clipboard of his professional concern. He stood at the gate for a moment before he opened it, which was different from how he usually moved through a property, and when he came to where Marin was standing at the water tank, he looked at the hogs for a long time before he looked at her. He said, "I lost 14 head." She said, "I heard." He said, "Your numbers are what they are." She said nothing. He said, "The pears." She said, "Among other things." He said he had not understood what she was doing in September, and he wanted to say that plainly. She looked at the animals. She said, "The season told me what it was going to be." Most people were not listening. He said, "I was not listening." She said, "I know." He stood there for another moment, and then he said that several producers in the valley were in a position where they could not finish their remaining animals without feed assistance that was not available at a price they could manage. And he asked her, with a directness that appeared to cost him something, whether she had capacity and whether she would consider taking in finishing animals from affected operations at a rate they could actually pay rather than a rate that reflected her advantage. She was quiet long enough that he began to speak again, and she stopped him. She said, I have the capacity. I will take 30 head total across whatever operations need the relief. The rate is my cost plus 10%. That is all I will charge. He said that was a rate substantially below what the market would bear, given the circumstances. She said, I know what the rate is. She took 30 head from 4 operations over the course of the following 3 weeks. She fed them at cost plus 10%, which was a rate so far below what the emergency feed situation had made theoretically possible that Todd Bierman, who heard about it through the co-op network and came to speak with her about it in early February, asked her directly whether she understood what she was leaving on the table. She said she did not think of it as a table. He said the figure, based on what he knew of comparable services in comparable situations in comparable counties in recent history, was significant. She said, the animals needed finishing, and the people needed help. He wrote something on his clipboard and did not come back. Dmitri finished his school notebook in February and started a second one. He bought it himself, the same brand, wire-bound, and he set it beside the first one on the barn office shelf where the coffee tin sat. He did not tell Marin he had done this. She saw it when she went to get the awls. She left it where it was. The spring came in the way springs come after hard winters, which is to say with the quality of a debt being paid in installments. The 30 animals that Marin had finished for the other operations went to market in early March, and their weights were respectable, which is to say they had recovered enough of what the bad autumn had taken from them that their owners received a return that made the difference between a difficult year and a surviving year, rather than between a difficult year and a closing year. This was remarked upon. The Producer Association meeting in March had Marin's name in it more times than she attended, which she did not, having sent Dmitri to observe and take notes, which he did in the wire-bound school notebook, sitting in the back row, writing in his large and reliable hand. Raymond Cates presented to the association that spring a proposal for what he called a forward conditioning protocol, which was a set of recommendations for supplemental feeding strategies in the late summer and early autumn period, based on a review of historical practices in the valley. He had asked Marin for access to the notebook in February. She had lent it to him for 2 weeks. He had returned it with a typed summary of the feeding notes clipped to the front cover and a handwritten note on the inside that said, "I should have read this 20 years ago." She put the typed summary inside the cover and returned the notebook to the coffee tin and placed the tin back on the 3rd shelf. The association voted to commission a producer guide based on the forward conditioning approach, drawing on both the Extension Office's trial data and the historical records from the Solstad operation. This was a bureaucratic and graceless phrase for what it actually was, which was the county formally acknowledging that a notebook kept in a coffee tin in a barn office on 40 acres had been right about something the Extension Office had not been. Todd Bierman was listed as a co-author of the guide. Marin was listed in the acknowledgments. She did not attend the meeting at which the guide was distributed, but Dmitri did, and he brought a copy home, and she read it that evening in the barn office with the stove going and the coffee tin on the shelf beside her. There is a painted stone at the edge of the Solstad property now, where the lane meets the county road, that was placed there by Dmitri, who is 37 today, and who runs the 40 acres and 14 additional acres he purchased from his mother's estate, and who has since expanded the operation to include a processing arrangement with 2 neighboring farms that share his conditioning protocol. The stone was not commissioned. He painted it himself in the winter, the way Marin had taught him to do things, which is to say slowly and in the time available, and without asking anyone's opinion of it. The stone says, "The animal tells you what the season has been. The season never lies." Marin Solstad knew this, Below that, in smaller letters, it says, "She taught the rest of us to listen." She died in the autumn of the year Dmitri turned 34, on a morning in late October that was exactly the kind of morning she had always said was her preferred kind, cold enough for breath to show and clear enough to see the tree line from the barn door. She had been to the lot that morning and checked the animals and found them, according to Dmitri, who was there, in exactly the condition she wanted them in for the winter ahead. She had looked at them for a long time and said, "They are ready." He had agreed that they were. She had gone in to have her coffee, and she had not come back out, and by the time Dmitri found her, the coffee tin was on the table and the notebook was open, and the morning light was coming through the east window, the way it does in October, thin and specific, laying a precise rectangle of gold across the page that held the August feeding notes, the page that always fell open of its own authority, the page that said, "The animal tells you what the season has been, and the season never lies."